October 28, 8:06 a.m. I had just returned from the grocery store when I noticed a white envelope resting in the center of my porch, placed too neatly to be accidental. The morning air was crisp, and the paper felt cold when I picked it up. Across the front, in heavy black print, was a stamp that stopped me mid-breath. Urgent property transfer, $7 million US, signature required, L. Grant. My daughter-in-law's signature. Marissa Grant. For a moment, the ground under me felt unsteady. I carried the envelope into the kitchen, setting it beside the grocery bags. As I did, the old baby monitor I kept in my coat pocket, something I used only to hear my elderly neighbor at night, slipped out and clicked on when it hit the counter. A burst of static, then a voice. Her voice. Marissa's. Low, sharp, unmistakably hers. I don't love him. I love the $7 million. Jason will sign anything. His mother won't even understand what's happening. My hand trembled. In my palm, a document tied to $7 million. In my ears, my daughter-in-law confessing to using my son. And the only thought that managed to form through the shock was, how could they do this to me? For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the kettle warming itself toward a boil. If this opening stirs something familiar in you, stay close, stories like these deserve to be heard. My name is Evelyn Carter, 55 years old, and I have lived long enough in this house to know the way the floorboards warm in the afternoon sun and the way the roof groans before a storm. When my husband died, I held this place together the only way I knew how, slowly, carefully, one responsibility at a time. I learned which bills could wait and which couldn't. I learned how to climb a ladder to fix a gutter, even when my knees protested. I learned how to be both the softness and the structure for my son. Jason has always been gentle, almost to a fault. As a child he apologized for things before he even finished doing them. As an adult, he poured that same gentleness into his patients. He became a surgeon who stayed late for families who needed answers and forgot to eat on the nights emergencies stacked one after another. I kept extra meals in the fridge for him, washed the scrubs he dropped near the door, and left notes reminding him that rest wasn't a luxury. And then there was Marissa. She arrived in our lives polished and poised, smiling with a warmth that never quite reached her eyes. At first, I thought she was simply nervous, new marriage, new home, new responsibilities. I tried to extend grace, to make space for her the way any mother would for the woman her son loved. But from the moment she crossed my threshold, something in her posture told a different story. She didn't look at the home the way a new family member might, with appreciation or curiosity. She looked at it like something she had already claimed. Her compliments came coated with subtle correction. Her smiles tightened whenever I entered the room. She spoke to Jason as if I were a guest in my own house. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself that change always brings friction. I reminded myself that I had raised a son who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to honor that. But in time, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Jason loved her with his whole heart. Marissa loved what belonged to him. And she depended on his exhaustion, and my silence, to blur the line between the two. I had given them stability, trust, and the best of myself. And quietly, steadily, they had begun planning a life that did not include me at all. I remember one small moment that should have warned me, though at the time it slipped past me like a faint draft under a door. It was the morning after their wedding, when the house still smelled of roses and leftover champagne. Jason carried their suitcases through the hallway, humming softly, tired from celebration but content in that gentle way he had always been. Marissa walked a few steps behind him, rolling her second suitcase over the threshold as if crossing into territory she already considered her own. She paused in the entryway, her eyes moving slowly across the living room, the beams my husband had sanded with his own hands, the old armchair where Jason learned to read, the framed photograph of our first winter in this home. Every piece carried a memory, a weight. I watched her narrow her eyes, not with resentment, but with ownership, calculation. Finally, stability, she said softly. Jason turned, smiling, misunderstanding entirely. Yeah, he said. A place to start fresh. But the way she said it lodged itself somewhere deep in me. I had assumed she meant emotional steadiness, a foundation for their new life together. I wanted to believe that. I clung to it. Only later did I understand she meant financial stability, security she had already marked out in her mind, long before she married my son. She didn't glance at Jason when she said it. She glanced at the house. I stood there in the faint morning light, holding a tray of fresh towels for the guest room they insisted on using until they found their own place. Marissa brushed past me lightly, her shoulder touching mine just enough to make me step back. "Do you have space in a closet for my coats?" she asked without looking at me. I brought more than expected. Her tone wasn't rude, just dismissive, as though my presence required small navigation rather than acknowledgement. I opened the hallway closet and shifted a stack of blankets to make room. She placed her coats inside without a word of thanks. Jason didn't notice, he was too busy placing their luggage upstairs, humming again, trying to make everything smooth. The moment faded, as quiet cracks usually do. But sometimes the smallest fracture foretells the shape of the break to come. And now, thinking back, I realized that morning had already told the truth I refused to hear. In the weeks that followed, the fracture widened in ways too subtle for Jason to notice. He worked long shifts, slept through sunrises, and rushed out the door before coffee finished brewing. Marissa, meanwhile, settled deeper into the rhythms of the house, moving objects without asking, rearranging shelves, placing her scented candles where my husband's old keepsakes once sat. It was small things at first. A vase shifted. A photo removed. My favorite mug placed on a higher shelf, just out of easy reach. When I offered breakfast, she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "No, thank you, Evelyn. I handle my own meals." Yet she ate whatever Jason prepared, praising him loudly while ignoring my quiet presence. One afternoon, I found her in the study, the room my husband had cherished most, leafing through drawers as though auditing the contents. She glanced up briefly, then continued her search. "Just familiarizing myself," she said. "If we're all living together, I should know where things are." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stayed behind my teeth. I told myself it wasn't worth pressing. I told myself she was adjusting. But each small intrusion pressed inward, like a thumb against a bruise. Jason never saw any of it. He saw only the woman who greeted him at the door, arms around his neck, telling him she missed him. He needed affection, reassurance, and she gave it freely in front of him. Behind him, her expression cooled, settling into something far more calculated. One evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, I overheard her speaking softly on the phone. Her voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before, light, amused, carefree. "It's temporary," she said. "Once things shift, it'll be exactly how it should be." When she saw me, she ended the call quickly and smiled. "Just checking in with a friend," she said. "Planning for the future." The future. I didn't know then how heavy that word would become. Still, I pushed aside the unease. I told myself she was young, uncertain, still settling into married life. I reminded myself that families must make room for one another, must stretch to accommodate differences. I had done it before, I could do it again. But the crack, the very first one, those words she spoke at the threshold, finally, stability, never fully left my mind. They echoed in quiet moments, resurfaced when I lay awake at night, replayed themselves when the house fell silent after Jason left for work. If I had listened to that echo sooner, perhaps the rest of the story would have unfolded differently. But I didn't. I let the crack spread, thin and quiet, until it shaped the fault line we would all eventually fall through. Looking back now, with everything I have learned, I see that the earliest warnings rarely shout. They whisper. They live in the way someone glances at what you treasure, or how they speak when they think you are not listening. At the time, I smoothed over each moment, telling myself it was easier to keep peace than to question intentions. I carried the weight of harmony the same way I carried the household, quietly, steadily, without complaint. But cracks do not stay small. They travel. They deepen. And the morning I found that envelope on my porch, the memory of that first faint fracture returned with astonishing clarity. It had been the start of everything, the moment when the house shifted just slightly beneath my feet, hinting at the break that was waiting to come. And now, as I look back, I see that the first crack was not just a passing moment but a quiet warning I chose not to name at the time. The shift in our home came gradually, almost politely, as though Marissa understood that a sudden change would draw Jason's attention. It began with small comments she delivered lightly, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a sigh, always crafted to sound harmless. "This armchair is a little outdated," she said one afternoon, running her hand along the fabric my husband had chosen years ago. I nodded, saying nothing, though the weight of her judgment settled heavily in the room. Soon it was the curtains. "These are an eyesore," she murmured, pulling at the fabric I had sewn by hand during a winter when Jason was still in medical school. My hands had been cold that season, the heater had broken, and I had stitched those curtains by the light of a single lamp. She didn't know that history. She didn't care to. At first Jason didn't hear any of it. He worked too many hours, returning home with shadows under his eyes and a soft gratitude for any warmth that awaited him. Marissa offered him that warmth in rehearsed gestures, a kiss on the cheek, a perfectly timed embrace, dinner plated just before he walked through the door. He leaned into it, needing the comfort, needing the illusion. Meanwhile, the house subtly rearranged itself under her influence. My husband's photographs disappeared from the hallway walls, replaced by abstract art pieces she ordered online. Minimal, she called them. Clean. I found the photos tucked into a drawer one morning, stacked carelessly, frames scraping against each other. I placed them back in the hallway. The next day, they were gone again. Then there were the visits, people I had never met, friends of hers who arrived in cloud-like perfume, speaking in loud, cheerful voices that filled every corner of the house. She shushed me gently when I tried to greet them, saying, "We're discussing something important." I would retreat to the kitchen, the only space that still felt like mine, listening to their laughter flow down the hall like a current I wasn't meant to step into. One evening, after one of her gatherings, I overheard her telling Jason, "When we renovate, we'll fix all of this." She gestured broadly, taking in the walls, the ceiling, the floors, as though the home I had kept afloat for decades was merely a flawed structure waiting for her direction. Jason nodded wearily, rubbing his temples. I stayed silent, holding a dish towel between my hands to steady myself. The deeper cuts came next. She began leaving lists on the counter, chores she expected me to complete in my own home. Dusting schedules. Linen rotations. Notes about guest readiness. 4 rooms Jason and I had always kept simple and uncluttered. I said nothing at first, unsure whether it was worth confronting her, unsure whether Jason had asked for something I didn't know about. When I finally mentioned it to him, he blinked in confusion. "Lists?" he asked. "I haven't seen any lists." His surprise was genuine. So was his exhaustion. He didn't have the strength to pursue it further. And so, I swallowed the humiliation the way many mothers do, with a quiet acceptance that settled into my chest. I told myself the situation was temporary. That once they found their own place, the balance would return. That I could endure this for a little longer. But the pressure kept building. Every day carried a new reminder that I was being nudged out of the life I had built, one gentle push at a time. She began referring to the home as our house when speaking to her friends, and I became Jason's mother, a background figure who shuffled quietly between rooms, tending to chores she no longer bothered to notice. One night, as I closed the windows before bed, I caught her standing in the yard, speaking to someone over the phone. Her voice was low, but the words carried through the still air. "Once everything is settled," she said, "it'll finally be ours. Completely." I stepped away from the window, heart beating slowly but firmly, the truth taking shape. The tension had become a living thing in the house, a presence that pressed against my ribcage and turned small tasks into silent battles. My home no longer felt like my own, and I understood, even then, that something larger was moving beneath the surface, something deliberate, patient, and dangerous. The next morning, Marissa placed a stack of catalogs on the kitchen table, luxury furniture, high-end fixtures, renovation layouts marked with sticky notes. I stood there in my robe, holding a cup of tea, while she flipped through pages covered in polished marble and glass. "These are just ideas," she said sweetly. "We'll make decisions once everything is officially aligned." Aligned. A simple word, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed control was already in her hands. Jason entered the kitchen moments later, kissing her on the temple before reaching for a mug. His smile was thin. "Long night," he said. She stroked his back, performing tenderness with practiced ease. He sighed, leaning into her touch. I looked at him then, really looked, at the fatigue hollowing his eyes, at the trust he carried without question, at the love that made him vulnerable in ways he didn't see. Marissa caught my gaze and held it for a moment, her expression unreadable, steady, cool. The catalogs remained on the table long after they left for the day. I didn't move them. The house felt too quiet, too aware of its own shifting shape. By then, the tension was no longer subtle. It hummed beneath every conversation, every footstep, every shared meal. But I still tried to make room for her, for them, for the possibility of harmony. I set the table carefully each evening. I kept the garden trimmed. I maintained the rhythms that had carried us through difficult seasons before. But she had begun speaking as if the future belonged solely to her, and I was merely a placeholder waiting to be moved aside. And though I didn't know the full shape of her intentions yet, I felt the ground beginning to tilt, inch by inch, toward something I could no longer ignore. The morning of the betrayal began like any other, with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the muted light pressing against the curtains. I had just finished watering the plants when I saw the envelope waiting on the porch, the same one that would split my world into before and after. Its edges were sharply creased, as though someone had prepared it with deliberate hands. I lifted it cautiously, feeling the weight inside, sensing that whatever rested within was not meant to be gentle. I carried it to the kitchen, setting it beside my mug. For a long moment, I simply stared at the stamp printed across its face, urgent property transfer, $7 million, signature required, L. Grant. My name was nowhere on it. The house I had held together through storms, bills, and grief had been reduced to a transaction, a figure marked in bold, impersonal ink. My breath came slowly, measured, as though my body already knew what I would find inside. When I opened the envelope, the paper slid out smoothly, too smoothly, as if they had been waiting for my hands. At the top of the document, beneath the heading, I saw her handwriting, Marissa's, practiced and looping, signing as though she had every right. Recipient, Marissa Grant, full ownership. Beneath it, the numerical figure repeated itself, clearer now, unmistakable. $7 million. A valuation that told me she had studied this property far more thoroughly than I had ever realized. Before I could gather myself, the old baby monitor crackled to life from my coat pocket. I had forgotten it was there, forgotten the way its outdated plastic sometimes switched on the moment it was jostled. What came through the static was no accident. It was a voice sharpened to a blade. Marissa's voice. She spoke to someone, Callum, a name I had heard only once in passing. Her tone was low, controlled, threaded with a certainty that turned my skin cold. Once Evelyn is declared incompetent, she said, the property is ours. Jason will sign whatever I put in front of him. He trusts too easily. She barely understands what's happening. Callum laughed softly, a humorless sound. Good, he said. Then everything will go smoothly. I stood in the stillness of the kitchen, the documents in my hand trembling. I thought of Jason, exhausted from long nights at the hospital, leaning on her for comfort he believed genuine. I thought of the dinners we had shared, the small gestures of peace I had guarded carefully, hoping for harmony. And I thought of how effortlessly she had planned to erase me, as though my life were nothing more than an obstacle she needed to step around. The betrayal settled over me slowly, like a chill in an old house, filling each corner until no warmth remained. It was not only the scheme itself but the ease with which she had woven it, the confidence with which she spoke of my removal, as though she had rehearsed the words many times before. I felt the weight of the papers, the weight of every moment I had allowed myself to doubt my instincts. There, in that quiet morning, with the kettle beginning its slow ascent toward a boil, I understood the truth. She had never seen me as family. She had seen me as property, something to claim, restructure, and inherit. And Jason, my son, had become the lever she used to pry open the life I had built. The hurt was sharp but steady, not frantic. A kind of clarity rose through the shock, a recognition shaped by months of small dismissals, silent corrections, and calculated intrusions. The envelope, the valuation, the whispered plan, they were not sudden. They were the conclusion of a pattern I had tried too long to ignore. I pressed a hand to the table, grounding myself in the familiar grain of the wood. The kitchen, with its humming appliances and worn tiles, felt both foreign and achingly known. My home, my history, my place of refuge had become the stage for their manipulation, laid out neatly in ink and signatures. I stood there, letting the truth settle into me fully, not rushing it, not pushing it away. The betrayal was vast, but understanding it required stillness. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake during Jason's childhood fevers, the years spent balancing bills with careful precision, the way I had stretched every resource to keep this house standing for him. Marissa had stepped into that legacy with a smile and a plan already forming behind her eyes. I wondered how long she had been preparing, how many conversations had shaped this moment, how many times she had looked at me and seen not a mother-in-law but a barrier. The papers lay open on the table, each line written with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was guaranteed. I traced a fingertip along the edge of the document, steady now, no longer trembling. Every sentence confirmed the same truth: she intended to take everything. Not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, through signatures and legal phrases designed to look official enough to slip past an overworked son and an unsuspecting woman. But I was not unsuspecting anymore. And as that realization took root, the fear that had hovered at the edges of my mind receded. In its place grew a quiet, deliberate strength, the kind that arrives only when there is no choice left but to act. I folded the papers carefully, aligning their edges with precision. The house felt still around me, as though waiting. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment shift from despair to decision. Whatever happened next, I would no longer move quietly through the space Marissa had tried to claim. I would not be erased. I straightened the documents, set them in a neat stack, and placed my hand firmly over them. The betrayal had revealed itself completely, and with it came a certainty I had not felt in months, the understanding that I still had choices, real ones, powerful ones, and that the life she had mapped out for me was not the one I would accept. The house was unbearably quiet after the betrayal revealed itself, as though the walls were holding their breath with me. I gathered the papers into a single stack and sat at the kitchen table, the place where so many ordinary mornings had started. The grain of the wood felt steady beneath my palms, familiar in a way nothing else did at that moment. I let the silence settle, let it fill the space Marissa had tried to claim. It was in that silence that clarity finally arrived, not as a burst of anger but as something calmer and deeper. I understood then that the danger was not just in what they had planned, but in how close I had come to overlooking it. The months of small dismissals, the slow erasure of my belongings, the quiet corrections that had chipped at my place in my own home, they formed a pattern I had tried to ignore. I had told myself I was keeping peace, that Jason needed rest more than conflict, that Marissa simply needed time. But every compromise had moved me one step further from the life I had built. Now, with the evidence laid out in front of me, there was no room left for doubt. The whispered plan on the baby monitor was not a misunderstanding. The forged signature was not a mistake. The valuation documents were not a coincidence. It was all deliberate, constructed with precision, and aimed squarely at the foundation of everything I had worked to protect. I rose from the table and crossed the room to the small safe tucked behind the pantry door, the same one my husband had installed years ago. Inside were the documents that truly mattered, the deed to the house, the insurance papers, the accounts I had managed carefully since his passing. I touched each one, feeling their edges, reassuring myself that they were still where they belonged. The familiarity of them steadied me. When I closed the safe, I did it slowly, deliberately, hearing the click of the lock echo through the quiet kitchen. It was the sound of a boundary closing, one that had remained open far too long. I stood there with my hand still on the door, knowing I had crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer reacting to what had been done, I was preparing for what I would do. I walked back to the table, breathing evenly, the documents still in a neat stack. The kettle clicked off beside me, the steam rising in a thin, wavering line. I poured the water into my cup, the scent of Earl Grey grounding me as the room settled around me. My hands were steady now. My thoughts were clear. I understood that waiting would only tighten the trap Marissa had set. She counted on hesitation, on my desire for peace, on the softness she mistook for weakness. But she did not know the years I had weathered storms alone, the nights I had balanced bills with precision, the resilience I had learned not from comfort but from necessity. She did not know that silence, for me, was not surrender, it was preparation. I gathered every piece of evidence, the envelope, the forged signature, the valuation, the recording from the baby monitor. I placed them in a folder, smoothing the edges, making sure nothing was out of place. The decision settled into me fully, like a weight I was finally strong enough to carry. Whatever they had planned for me, whatever future they believed they controlled, I would not walk into it blindly. I stood, smoothing the front of my sweater, feeling the firmness in my posture return. The air in the room felt different now, not lighter, but sharper, as if the house itself had shifted in recognition of the change within me. I slipped the folder into my bag, the weight of it resting against my side like a promise. Each document, each word spoken through that crackling monitor, formed a line of defense I had not known I would ever need. Before stepping out, I paused at the doorway and looked back at the kitchen. The chair slightly pulled out from the table, the cup of tea cooling beside the folder's imprint, the soft light settling across the countertops, it all felt achingly familiar, and yet changed. This was the home I had held together for years, the space I had poured myself into, the place Marissa had tried to claim through deception. But it was also the ground on which I would stand now, not in fear, but in certainty. I reached for my keys, their metal edges warm from the sunlight streaming through the window. As I closed my fingers around them, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, agency. The kind that comes not from confrontation, but from clarity. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the crisp air filling my lungs and waking every sense. There was no shaking in my hands. No wavering in my steps. I locked the door behind me with a quiet click, the same sound I had heard from the safe minutes earlier. It echoed with the same finality. I walked down the path slowly, feeling each step anchor me further into the decision I had made. I did not know every detail of what awaited me, but I knew enough. I knew where I needed to go. I knew what needed to be said. As I reached my car, I placed the bag on the passenger seat and sat for a moment, letting the stillness settle once more. My reflection stared back at me from the rearview mirror, not frightened, but steady. Older, yes. Tired, yes. But unbroken. Marissa had counted on the kind of silence that dissolves a person from the inside out. But the silence that filled me now was different. It was resolve. It was direction. It was the sound of a woman reclaiming her place in her own life. With a steady breath, I turned the key in the ignition and began to drive, the folder resting safely beside me. The moment of realization had arrived fully, shaping itself into a single, unwavering truth: whatever came next, I would meet it head-on. And I would do so with the strength I had earned quietly, over years no one had bothered to notice. The drive to the Elder Protection Division was steady and quiet, the road unfolding in smooth stretches before me. I kept both hands on the wheel, the morning light drifting across the windshield in slow, deliberate rays. Beside me, the folder lay still, its edges aligned, its contents gathered with the precision of someone who had finally decided there would be no more waiting. I felt each mile carry me further from the passivity that had allowed Marissa's plans to root themselves, and closer to the clarity I needed to move forward. Inside the office, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and antiseptic. A receptionist with soft eyes directed me to a waiting area, where the chairs were arranged neatly around a low wooden table stacked with pamphlets. I took a seat, holding the folder close, feeling its weight settle into my lap. When the attorney finally called my name, I rose with a steadiness that surprised me. His office was simple, lined with shelves of legal texts and neatly arranged files. He greeted me calmly, gesturing for me to sit. "How can I help you today?" he asked. His voice was low, measured, offering no assumptions. That alone eased a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. I placed the folder on his desk and opened it slowly. One by one, I laid out the evidence, the envelope with its bold stamp, the forged signature, the valuation documents, the property transfer form, and finally the small device, the baby monitor, with the recording saved inside. I explained everything quietly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. He listened without interruption, leaning forward slightly as the details began to form a coherent picture. When the recording played, his expression changed, not with shock, but with the recognition of a pattern he had seen too many times. He took a slow breath, then folded his hands in front of him. "This," he said carefully, "is a classic case of financial exploitation. You've done the right thing by coming here immediately." His reassurance did not bring relief, not exactly, but it brought validation. A confirmation that my instincts had not been wrong, that the cracks I had noticed were not imagined. He explained the steps clearly: asset protection orders, freezes on pending transfers, legal notices to prevent unauthorized actions taken in my name. Each measure felt like a brick being placed back into a foundation that had been shifting beneath me for far too long. He drafted the first set of documents while I sat across from him, the soft tapping of his keyboard filling the room. When he slid the pages toward me, the paper felt warm, freshly printed. "These will initiate the process," he said. "Once filed, any attempt to move your property or override your decisions will be immediately blocked." I read each line, absorbing the language carefully, then signed with a steady hand. The pen glided smoothly, the ink drying in dark strokes that felt irreversible and necessary. When it was done, he gathered the papers with methodical care, placing them into a new folder marked with my name. As I prepared to leave, he looked at me with a kind of quiet respect. "You acted before any irreversible damage was done," he said. "That takes strength." Strength. The word settled into me slowly, like warmth returning to a hand that had been numb. Outside, the afternoon sun had risen higher, spilling light across the parking lot. I walked to my car with a sense of direction so clear it felt almost physical. The steps ahead were still daunting, but they were mine to take. I unlocked the door, placed the new folder beside the old one, and sat for a long moment, letting the stillness breathe through me. Back at home, the house greeted me with a silence that felt different than the one I had left behind. This silence was no longer heavy with dread, but open, expectant. I stepped inside and set the folders on the table, noting how the sunlight touched their edges. For months, I had moved through these rooms shrinking myself so someone else could expand. Now, standing in the center of my own kitchen, I felt the opposite beginning to take shape. I made copies of every document, labeling each set neatly. I uploaded digital backups to a secure drive, careful to check each file twice. My movements were calm, deliberate, free of the hesitation that had shadowed me for so long. Every action felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been tucked away. Later, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the street outside. Neighbors walked their dogs, children rode bikes, cars hummed softly along the road. Life moved forward in ordinary ways, unaware of the storm that had passed through this house. For the first time in a long while, I felt myself anchoring, quietly, steadily, into the clarity I had earned. What came next would not be simple. Marissa would not remain passive when the legal notices reached her. Jason would have questions, heavy ones. There would be conversations that pressed into old wounds, truths that could not be softened. But I was no longer entering those moments as a woman waiting to be overruled. The day slowly unwound around me, each hour marked by a steadiness I had not felt in months. I walked through the house with measured steps, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a picture frame, the smooth surface of the banister, reminding myself that this space, this life, was still mine to shape. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I turned off the lights one by one as evening settled in, each switch clicking softly in the quiet rooms. There was no fear left in the shadows, only resolve, patient and steady, waiting for the next step I was ready to take. The legal notices arrived at the house 2 days later, delivered in crisp envelopes that landed on the kitchen table with a weight far heavier than paper. I wasn't there when Jason found them, but I could imagine the moment clearly, the furrow in his brow, the slow exhale, the dawning confusion. For years he had moved through life trusting the people closest to him, believing good intentions were the rule, not the exception. Now, the certainty he carried like a second skin was beginning to crack. He called me late in the afternoon, his voice thinner than usual. "Mom," he said, "can we talk tonight?" I could hear it. He already sensed that whatever lay before him would redraw the lines of our family. I agreed, keeping my own voice steady. When he arrived, he held the envelopes in his hands, turning them over as if searching for a different answer than the one printed in clear legal terms. "Why would someone file these?" he asked, confusion tightening his posture. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I gestured toward the table, where I had laid out the copies of the documents Marissa had attempted to sign. His eyes landed on the forged signature first, then the valuation form, and finally the property transfer request. His breath caught softly. "Mom, did she do this?" I nodded once. The truth settled between us with the quiet heaviness of a winter snowfall. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face. It was not disbelief that struck him, it was recognition. Pieces falling into place. Nights of strange conversations. Papers he hadn't remembered signing. The growing distance between us that he had blamed on exhaustion. And then, without a word, I pressed the small recorder into his palm. He listened. Every word. Every calculated intention spoken in Marissa's own voice. I watched as the realization formed, slow and devastating, reshaping the way he understood his marriage. He didn't speak for a long time, and when he finally lifted his head, the look in his eyes was not anger, it was heartbreak. "I should have seen it," he whispered. "No," I said gently. "You trusted someone you loved. There is no fault in that." The rest unfolded quickly. He confronted her that evening, placing the injunction in front of her without raising his voice. Marissa tried to laugh it off at first, but the tremor beneath her rehearsed smile gave her away. When Jason mentioned the recording, the color drained from her face completely. The truth left her nowhere to stand. Within a week she moved out, packing her things with clipped movements, avoiding my eyes as she carried boxes through the doorway she had once entered with such certainty. Jason watched from the porch, silent, hollow. The house seemed to exhale when the last box left its threshold. But the consequences extended beyond our walls. The failed transfer triggered investigations. The bank flagged unusual activity tied to her accounts. The attorney notified the proper channels, ensuring nothing slipped through unseen. Marissa's confidence dissolved in the face of processes she couldn't charm, bend, or outrun. Jason, meanwhile, slept in the guest room for several nights, the weight of betrayal anchoring him in place. I heard him moving through the house at odd hours, pausing in doorways as though relearning each room. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured, searching for solid ground. Back at home, the quiet inside the house shifted into something gentler. Jason began sorting through the remnants of his life with Marissa, the drawers she had organized to her liking, the closets she had filled with her scent, the notebooks where she had sketched plans for rooms she believed would one day belong to her. He moved slowly, thoughtfully, as though each object required translation. Sometimes he paused, holding something in his hands before letting it go. Other times he left the room abruptly, the weight of betrayal pressing too heavily on him to stay. I didn't hover. I simply kept the kettle warm, the lights steady, the house open. Healing, I knew, wasn't something that could be rushed or managed. It needed room to settle. And gradually, I began to see moments of ease return to his posture, a longer breath, a softer gaze, a hint of clarity where confusion had lived for too long. Meanwhile, Marissa's attempts to regain control faltered quickly. When she tried to contact Jason, he declined the calls without hesitation. When she sent messages demanding explanations, he read them once and placed the phone face down on the table. Her certainty, once sharp enough to cut, had dulled against the truth she could no longer twist. One evening, as rain tapped steadily against the windows, Jason and I sat together in the living room, the soft lamplight casting warm shadows across the walls. He spoke more openly than he had in months, about the pressure he had carried, the warning signs he had ignored, the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. I listened, letting him speak without interruption, knowing he needed space to lay down the weight he had been holding alone. By the time the rain eased, something in him had settled. In the weeks that followed, the house began to breathe again, slowly at first, like someone waking after a long sleep. The tension that had once settled in every corner loosened, replaced by a quieter rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. I moved through the rooms with a steadiness I hadn't known in months, touching the furniture Marissa had dismissed, straightening the photographs she had hidden away, letting each small act reclaim a piece of what had been taken. Jason stayed with me during that time, occupying the guest room, the one she had always insisted should be turned into her creative space. He carried a heaviness that didn't lift quickly, but I noticed the small shifts, the way he lingered at the breakfast table a little longer, the way his shoulders softened when he realized he didn't have to defend every thought. The house offered him a kind of quiet he hadn't known he needed. We didn't rush conversations. They came in fragments, over tea, over folded laundry, during slow evenings when the sun drifted low across the porch. He spoke of long shifts, of the pressure he'd been carrying, of the fear that he had failed me by not seeing what was happening right under his roof. I told him the truth gently, that love often blinds us, and that trusting the people we let into our lives is not a weakness. It's human. Bit by bit, the routines we once shared returned. I cooked meals the way he liked them, and he repaired the back steps the way his father once had. We worked side by side in the yard, clearing leaves and trimming branches, settling the garden back into its proper shape. The air felt cleaner somehow, no longer crowded with unspoken intentions. Soon, he began looking for his own place again, not out of distance but out of renewal. We visited a few small apartments near the hospital. Nothing extravagant, simple spaces filled with light, places where he could begin again without shadows trailing him. Each time we left a showing, he asked, "What do you think?" and I could hear the hope in his voice. It was the first hope I'd heard from him in months. Meanwhile, I allowed myself to return to the parts of my life I had quietly set aside. I enrolled in the coastal photography course I had admired for years, a small Wednesday evening class at the community center. The first night, I arrived early, camera in hand, nerves buzzing in my chest. But when the instructor dimmed the lights and spoke about capturing the quiet truth of a landscape, something inside me settled. I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. On weekends, I drove to the shoreline with my camera, letting the wind tangle my hair as I studied the shifting waves. Cape Kiwanda had always been a dream of mine, and now Jason and I were planning a trip there, nothing extravagant, just a simple journey to stand beside the cliffs and feel the wind rush up from the sea. A place to begin again. The house itself changed in subtle ways. I rearranged the living room, restoring the armchair Marissa had called outdated to its rightful place by the window. I opened the curtains she had dismissed and let the morning light wash across the room. I lit the lavender candle I had tucked away months earlier. Everything felt quieter, warmer, steadier. Some afternoons I found myself sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the neighborhood settle into its familiar evening rhythm. Children's laughter drifted from down the street, and the scent of pine carried on the breeze. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to brace myself for someone else's footsteps or someone else's criticism. The quiet felt honest now, not imposed. I began reconnecting with people I had slowly distanced myself from, old friends who had wondered why I'd grown so busy, Neighbors who had noticed the strain in my smile but didn't press. They welcomed me back with the gentle ease of those who understand that life sometimes knots itself around you without warning. We shared stories on park benches and laughed in ways that reminded me how good it felt to belong somewhere without conditions. As the weeks passed, Jason began smiling more, small smiles at first, then the kind that reached his eyes. He'd come home from a shift and tell me about a patient who'd improved, or a colleague who'd made him laugh. The heaviness didn't vanish, but it eased, reshaping itself into something he could carry without sinking. There was no triumph in any of it, only balance. A balance earned through difficult choices and quiet strength, through boundaries set without cruelty, through the steady reclamation of a life almost taken from me. I didn't seek revenge. I sought restoration. And slowly, restoration came. In the stillness that followed everything, I found myself relearning how to breathe inside my own life. The house felt different now, not because anything grand had changed, but because the heaviness Marissa brought with her had finally lifted. Light settled into corners that had felt tense for months, and I realized how deeply the atmosphere of a home can shift when trust is restored. I spent more mornings on the porch, watching the street wake up, letting the quiet settle into me without fear. For so long I had tiptoed through my own rooms, careful not to invite conflict, careful not to appear in the way. Now I walked freely, touching the back of my late husband's chair, opening windows wide, letting the air move without permission from anyone but me. Jason carried his own wounds, but every day brought a small piece of healing back to him. And as he grew steadier, so did I. We spoke honestly, gently, without the shadows that had hovered over us. The truth had cost us both something, but it had returned something even more important, clarity. What I learned is simple: silence can protect peace, but it can also bury you if you let it. And when someone tries to diminish your place in your own life, the quietest boundary can become the strongest one you ever set. If this story touched a familiar place in you, stay close. Here, silence becomes strength.